Welcome back, folks, to another soul-driven discussion. We haven't had one of these in a hot minute, but they're still around, they're still happening. And of course, I have to have folks back that I love talking to when it comes to discussions because, yeah, getting down to the nitty-gritty of whatever it is that I want to discuss needs to be done with someone that I admire and appreciate. And so I am excited to reintroduce you to Neil Disyamonthon, an Akashic record reader and emotional healer who has been on the show a couple of times. What's up, Neil? Thanks for
Hey,
coming
hey,
back.
hey. You are very, very welcome. I'm so happy to be back.
Yes, it's going to be fun and so good. So good. Neil and I have been talking about this for quite a while. So pretty pumped to sit down and kind of dive in deep. God, love, the whole thing. So first of all, I'm not going to spend a ton of time introducing you to Neil, but I would like to share that if you want to know him intimately, deeply, check out episode 38 and 54, two different episodes that we did together, where you can definitely get to know Neil. We dove really deep on the Akashic Records for the last one, which is episode 54. So a couple that you can check out to get to know this wonderful person, even more the details about his life. But of course, as we're going to discuss, these things are forever evolving and changing. So, okay. So today's discussion, God. There's a lot of stereotypical ideas about God in this world, how God is viewed, how God feels toward us, wants from us, how to treat God, all kinds of different things. But I felt it would be really helpful to share what it actually looks like to have a real, authentic relationship with God, kind of dispel the myths, the ideas that many of us have or have had at one point in time, mostly just have an honest discussion about God's role in our life. One of the things that Neil and I first bonded over when we met was our personal relationships with God. And over the past couple of years of knowing each other, that relationship with God has changed and evolved in so many different ways. Ways that might be confusing to some folks, might seem like it's going into a negative or opposite direction, but actually it's just really bringing us to that next level. Because similar to any other relationship in our life, our relationships with God, source, universe, whatever the case may be, there are peaks and valleys, ebbs and flows, and God is no different. It requires time and investment to cultivate something beautiful, but regardless of what we do, it is always available to us. Before we kind of dive in, Neil, is there anything you want to kind of share about that?
I was thinking back to when we first met and how you're saying we bonded over God. And I am just chuckling in my head because we were different in a way because you grew up with God and I grew up with Buddhism and then later broke free of that and came into God. It was just a funny little laugh I had in my head. But now let's dive on in.
Yeah, it's a good one. It's a good one. So, first, I thought we would kind of kick this off with defining who God is to us, because I think it's important. I know that God can be a triggering word for a lot of people, and it can definitely carry some pretty heavy connotations. So, in regards to the way that I view God, God for me is love. And it's always been just that simple. God equals love. And so God could be, universe, Buddha, source, goddess, whatever it is that someone else might call God, as long as it is founded in love. That is how I've always viewed God. So, what about you, Neil? What's your definition of God?
I, when I think about God, like innately, the first thing that comes up is I think about it from a Western religious framework, but my own knowing of God is kind of beyond that. But there's still a little bit of this like all knowing creator in the sky, in the universe. just stripped of everything and every label we've put on that. But it's still that same similar sort of just like this all knowing, loving presence. But, I was thinking about the ways we see God when you were sharing that and the different people. And I just wanted to share one thing because this was really profound to me when I heard this a long time ago, and it really stuck out to me. And I think this ties into how you share God, right? It's just love. And I think we all see God in the ways we're supposed to. And across different countries, different nationalities, ethnicities, cultures, whatever, you see them in the way that you know God. And that comes as this religious figure or this being in the sky or just love itself. But I think we feel and perceive God in exactly the way that we need to. That makes sense to us and who we are. But ultimately, yeah, it's love.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think the word that most seems fitting to me outside of God would be creator.
Mm-hmm.
The
Yeah, I agree with
creator
that.
of all things and everything. Um, so I'm curious because, like you just mentioned, you come from a Buddhist background. And so, what was it
Mm-hmm.
like growing up in a Buddhist family? Was God something that you talked about? Did you view Buddha as God? Like, what is your background there?
I have a few little things here. It's funny because you said that. I immediately thought of my brother. He was a troublemaker. He went to private school. So he grew up with the nuns. And um, though he
Like
grew up in this Buddhist household with my mom, who's like the hardcore Buddhist, but he grew up with the nuns. Um,
like Christian nuns?
mhm. Yeah,
Okay.
he went to from elementary school forward because he just kept getting in trouble. So they needed the strict nun with a ruler. Um,
Well, I just learned like pretty recently that there are such things as Buddhist nuns.
there
Like Pema
are.
Chödrön is a Buddhist nun. And I was like, what? If I would have known that, I mean, I might have enlisted at some point, but just saying.
You may have been one at some point. Old lives.
Yes.
But yeah, there are. And that's actually, this all comes from my mom. She didn't grow up super Buddhist. She came into it as a way of learning to deal with a lot of her anger and her emotions. And I know at the end of her life, she wants to be a nun. If we weren't here, if the family weren't here, she'd be a Buddhist nun. She'd shave her head and do the whole thing and be wearing nothing but white and just connecting all day long. But for me, I grew up very Buddhist, but I didn't see Buddha as God. For my mom, she does. That's her God all the way. There's nothing else. But I was also the black sheep. As much as I was deeply in Buddhism, I questioned a lot of it. And there were questions that I couldn't get answers to. And my mom's answer is, well, then you're just not ready for it. That's okay. Whereas, like, no, I was actually seeing right through a lot of the limitations for it. And where, as I grew up and I started to separate from it more and more and more. And I came into this time, I was like, I just don't resonate with it anymore. And at the same time, I was starting to consider myself spiritual. Maybe I just believe in just something beyond. It doesn't have quite a figure. And I don't believe in God from this Western lens. So it doesn't quite fit. I'm just spiritual. There's something more. I believe in that. I just don't want to put any labels or biases or whatever on it.
How old were you?
And that it was when I was going to grad school. So early 20s, just about like 21, 22. Um, and that trickled in and eventually grew more and more and more. And then all of a sudden, when I was working and coming into spirituality and all this stuff started to happen and all the intuition started to kick in, I started to get drawn into the world of psychics and this whole magical side of spirituality. And then I started to have greater connections and experiences with this God fella, this God lady, this God figure. And it continually evolved more and more and more. So it was an interesting path.
Yeah, that's cool. For me, and I've shared this on the podcast before, and of course, you and I have talked about it so many times, but I mean, I was just born into this life knowing God. There was never a question
Hmm.
for me, never a, but at the same time, I was always really curious about God and how God might show up or where we might find God, because I grew up in the Christian church and there was so much that
Right.
I disagreed with. Like I was just not down for the preacher who was jumping up and down every Sunday and yelling and screaming at us. And I'm like, uh-huh. And just so many different things. And I was really drawn to learning about religions. I mean, I just wanted to know, because there was so much I
Hmm.
disagreed with within Christianity. And because I had grown up in a Christian home, I assumed that God was this thing that you found within a religion, within a channel. And of course, I didn't think about it that clearly when I was younger, but now I see that that was really, just kind of the way that I viewed it because of my upbringing. So I was constantly like looking into different religions and learning about, their like figureheads and, like who was their Jesus and what was their deal and what did they believe and did I align with those things? And um,
Hmm.
I think for me, like Islam and Muhammad was like probably the closest that I came to like really feeling like, ooh, this feels really interesting to me. This feels really good to me. But then of course I dug a little deeper and I was like, maybe not so
Oh,
much.
this is really restrictive too.
But there's so many different things like I love within the Jewish faith that they are encouraged to question God, which I think is
Hmm.
so healthy. And that was always one of my biggest issues growing up within the church was like, no, 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 you're just supposed to accept that this is what is right, this is what is wrong, this is what God says, this is what God does. And of course, all of those things came through the regurgitation of someone else. And I just wasn't having that. It didn't feel right to me. There were some things that might have made logical sense, but still, it just didn't feel right to me. Um, so, even though I always knew God, it was always this for me, like this experience of, and I think it really took off when I was starting to come into my teens pretty hugely. And then I just became like a weird child who like wanted to talk about God with anyone who would talk to me. And even when I
Are you
was
going to this
like,
party? Yeah, God's coming with me. Did you know that?
well, I mean, I was just curious how other people knew
Right.
God and what their experiences with God was and like how they interacted with God. It was so curious to me. I mean, I was legit like 21 in bars, like talking to people about God, not
I can so see
proselytizing or
that.
trying to like, I was never interested in trying to get someone to believe what I believed. I always knew that like, you know, I guess the way that I looked at it was like, because people would try to argue with me all the time. They just couldn't handle a Christian who wasn't trying to convert them,
Hmm.
you know? And so but my thing was just like, I know this to be true, and this is what I don't question. What you do for yourself is your own thing. And I respect whatever that is. Um, in the midst of being a Buddhist, did you have any sort of those feelings like the them versus us sort of thing, or like kind of feeling like people, who weren't in Buddhism were missing it or anything like that? Did you ever have any of those thoughts or
The one thing with Buddhism that made it hard to push back on it was that it's so loving and kind and accepting.
yeah,
And so a lot of that wasn't there. It was, um, I remember lots of times having conversations about different religions. And like, I think about Christianity, and I have family members who are Christian, and then mom is Buddhist. And conversations around that and what happens, what it looks like. And they're just saying, like, you can't go to another religious place. You can't go to a temple. You can't do any of this. Whereas we said, like, come one, come all, like everyone come in and have some food with us and hang out and talk and be in community. So that made it really hard to hate or to push against. There was things that I questioned about it that were always there, and frankly, I can't even remember what it is I questioned about it anymore. But yeah, I had somewhere to take that, and it totally just left me.
Yeah, I
this is
think
what I have. Deep spiritual mode. Brain goes bye-bye.
We had like a 2-minute long yawn before we started recording. Neil's like, here comes the energy.
The Neil special.
That was something that I really appreciated about Buddhism when I really started learning about it. And I think Buddhism was one that I started learning about later, because when I was younger, I still had a lot of that sort of fear mentality that comes with Christianity of like, no, you don't want to do that because you're opening yourself up to Satan or demons, or you know what I mean? And so even though I was like the most liberal Christian, I always knew I still had my boundaries that I just wasn't sure of. It's really wild to think back to who I was in those times.
Right.
But yeah, there was this, like, even in my mind, there was always this back and forth sort of battle of like all of the conditioning about people who weren't Christians and what was going to happen to them or what they weren't privy to, versus the part of me that was just like, the God I know would like not ever leave people behind. Like that just never made sense to me. And I remember reading The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis. And it's this beautiful story about a man whose wife dies, and she goes to hell, and he goes to like rescue her and like bring her to heaven. And the book is very much about like, God doesn't put us in heaven or hell. That's like not a thing. And I remember reading that, was just like, yes. Because, C.S. Lewis was one of those people that was revered even within the Christian church. He was fully accepted in Christianity. And when I read that, it was like, exactly, this is how it feels more like, this felt more true to me than anything I had learned within the church. But I guess that's where you get all your lovey-dove teddy bearness from. You kind of brought that into
100%.
to spirituality with you, since the acceptance of it, because I feel like people like myself who did grow up seeing that divide, even if it was a divide we didn't agree with, can still sometimes get into that mentality of like us versus them, or you know what I mean? Like, oh my gosh, this is information you don't know or you aren't aware of. Is anything like that come up for you now, ever?
Say it again.
Does any of that like ever come up for you in the midst of like, maybe like talking with folks who aren't plugged into spirituality, who aren't aware of the metaphysical, who do you see them as like different, or is that sort of like all mentality from, your Buddhist background? Is that more of where you exist? Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's never in that direction. It's always the other way. And this is part of my own personal story of like, I'm all accepting and I just love people, right? Whoever you are, whatever your belief is, that is your soul plan. That is what you're here to experience. And life will take you the way you're supposed to experience it. On the other end, arrow pointed back at me, there, in part of my own lessons in this life, there's always been a felt level of separation. So as much as I am loving acceptance of others, I've always felt kind of alone in my lone wolf, and I don't fully fit in Buddhism. I don't maybe fully fit in spirituality. I don't fully fit in all these things. But at the same time, as we're speaking that, I don't feel a divide to any of it. And I think that's this God connection that that I've really had a lot of time to spend experiencing the last few years. There is no separation. There is just love. And as I've spent more time connecting with God, as I've gone into more and more deeper, much more deeper work within myself, that's just become ever more pervasive. Like it's just, we're just all here together, and it's super lovey-dovey sometimes. I used to really feel that divide, and I'm just reflecting on it right now, and I really haven't recently, or really within the last year. So that's actually really cool.
That's a good thing.
Yeah.
Was there
I'm
like a
processing
specific
as we're talking.
in real time? Um, how did God come into your life? Was there like a specific thing? Was there an event, or was it just a shift? Like, how did that happen for you?
I mean, it started with that me transitioning into spirituality, right? Like I believe that there is something more, something greater, something that control is not the right word, but just like is everything, right? Um, but there was one prime moment that I will always remember, and it came in a breathwork session. So this was, I think, before I started working with the records. I was like just beginning to do energy work and just beginning to step into channeling. And I went to this holotropic breathwork workshop. So basically, breathwork for altered consciousness. And it was a 2-hour workshop. And I remember getting there, like, no clue what's going on, no clue what to expect. And kind of they take us through this experience. And within probably about 30 seconds, I'm just in it deep. And things are starting to go crazy. And it's intense. The sensation that I was feeling in my hands and in my feet, the only thing I describe them is like they felt like black holes of energy. And it it wasn't quite pain, but it was that sort of intensity. It was the most intense thing I'd ever felt my entire life. And I remember just being like, I need to push through this. I need to push through this. I got to keep going. I signed up for 2 hours. I got to be doing this thing. And I'm just breathing and pushing and working and trying to keep going through. And then this moment happens where I just get this voice that pops in like, you don't have to. You don't have to keep doing this. You showed up and you've done what you needed to. Just stop, let go, relax. And then just as that happens, the music that they're playing in the background switches to this like heavenly music. But that voice was this voice of God. It was this most loving, most kind, gentle, nourishing, yet just large, intense energy to it. And God spoke. And then I stopped and I finished the session. And then everyone else was still going, but I took those words that came to me, and I stopped, and then I just started to seeing like energy flowing into all the different people around me, and all this crazy, crazy spiritual stuff starting to happen. But it was a really beautiful, very profound moment. And funny enough, it really is symptomatic of like all my experiences and lessons put into one moment.
I love that. I love that. Yeah, God has come through and spoken to me two different times in my life very clearly, like you and I are speaking.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember the second time that it happened to me, I was in a Barnes and Noble. Actually, it's a really cool story, but when he started speaking, I just kind of automatically started crying because it was
Mm-hmm.
so loving, so epically loving. I knew it was going to stop. I knew it couldn't last. I like knew about my humanity in the midst of it. And I was crying because I didn't want it to end, because I didn't want him to leave.
Yeah.
Um, and I think those are moments that for those of us who are searching, I think we find. And when we open ourselves up, it comes through. when we let go, when we surrender, and or when we are really lost. I don't know about you, but I've certainly read many times about, folks being lost in their lives and hearing a voice coming through. Um, it happens with some of my clients, and we can chalk these voices up to whatever and be like, oh, I didn't hear it, or like, you know what I mean? All of those coincidence type things. But
Mm-hmm.
man, I think that those moments are huge. Um, so how did that redirect your life after that? Like, how did that impact you?
It was nothing too conscious at that time. Um, it was a really crazy moment, and it was the start of everything. That's the way I see it. It's kind of what kicked off everything. And then I came into the records and started to really consciously connect to this God energy. And I was channeling this voice of God would come through, and all these things would happen. In hindsight, looking back at all that time, though, that was never as pure as that one single moment. Um, but what's actually been the most profound for me is what you and I have talked about the end of last year, this winter going into the start of the year. It was that seeking God. Um, I had separated from spirit and was going through this mini dark night of the soul and breakdown after breakdown after breakdown, and felt so alone and miserable. And I needed that connection with God. And God came, but not in that way. And I think this is a really relatable story for a lot of people. God came through my own cultivation of faith and surrender, and just in the most human way possible, saying like, there's something and I'm being guided. And as difficult as this is, I'm being watched after. And I really learned to develop faith. And that was connection to God in a new way that I'll say is so much more profound. The other way is really exciting and has bells and whistles and this moment of God. It was cool. But this one is, right, is God through the human heart. And being able to cultivate that is something that I can always really fall back to. And I think will always carry me through difficult times.
So just to clarify, because obviously I was privy to this
Mm-hmm.
journey as your friend and know kind of the ins and outs of it. But for folks who are listening and aren't really sure, share a little bit more with us about this difficult time that you're going through in regards to like why you kind of lost your spirituality for a little while, and then um, some of potentially like the practical ways, some of those steps that you took to like rebuild that relationship or come back to God, or whatever it was. I don't want to
Mm-hmm.
put words in your mouth, but yeah, just kind of maybe bring that to life for us a little bit more.
Yeah. So this ties into a lot of the Buddhism stuff. What Buddhism really did for me was there's a level of selflessness in there where it's about everyone else and not about me. So my story and my healing work has been about building a sense of self, working through this low self-worth that I've always had. And me coming into God from that point on, where I did that breathwork session moving forward, was also through my Saturn return. And it was building a sense of self, and all these connections and all these spiritual things happening. They were building up this ego in a sense. And after finishing my Saturn return, there was a level of me needing to break free from that, and also to break free from that ego, that spiritual ego that I developed. And so there was a half year where it just like everything immediately shifted, as deeply as I was very spiritual and connected to all these things. And it was such a big part of me and spirit, and it was magic. All of a sudden it ended. And basically a snap of a finger, it just ended and it wasn't there anymore. And I was learning to just be human again and be Neil again. And it was like that went deeper and deeper and deeper as the year progressed. There was less and less spirit, more and more human, more and more Neil, until the very end of the year. All of a sudden, it was just me. And then I was being taken through all these experiences of just like breakdown after breakdown after breakdown, through different various different things in my life that were difficult. And it took me to this breaking point where it's just like, well, what now? I have absolutely nothing. I don't even have this sense of self that I've developed, this character that's come to life over these last few years. And I came across this book called Becoming a King. And it was written by a pastor, but it was written by this pastor who kind of approaches it from God, from the way you and I are speaking about God, not through the full lens of Western religion, but through just this connection to God, and what that really means. And it was about becoming the version of yourself that can lead the kingdom, that can lead as someone here to bring forward this loving God energy to the world. And every chapter I read brought me into deeper and deeper faith. And what really made the most impact for me, there was nothing super magical happening. There was nothing very, very, I don't have any hacks or tricks. It was about intention and faith, and allowing myself to remember that and choose that in the times that I really felt it the least. And when I didn't have it, going back to this book and feeling it through these words, feeling it through someone who deeply does, and letting that carry me forward. It almost feels like someone coming into faith through religion, like reading it through the Bible, but just without all these connotations and all these things attached to it. It's just like this word, and this word that is love. And that's what I was learning.
Yeah, coming back into, I remember for me, I think one of the periods of time where I really fell away from God was after doing something that I had sworn I would never do, which was specifically cheating on my boyfriend at the time. And I felt so ashamed that I had to completely back away from God and just disconnect for a while. I didn't know, I was young, was in my mid-20s, and didn't know how to navigate that. I think that at least for me, how important integrity is for me. We joke about that a lot. And for me to have thought one thing of myself and then to have done another thing was really humbling and soul crushing, I think, in a lot of ways. And I couldn't find that connection with God anymore. And of course, in the midst of it, I didn't realize that I was disconnecting because of my shame. And it felt more so like I had let God down, like I had, like God had walked away from me or something. I couldn't fully understand or articulate what it was that was going on, but it was just this thing that, like, boom, kind of like you're talking about, happened so fast. And my life was so empty during that time. And I ended up, dating this person. And I remember telling him, like, we need to break up and maybe like meet down the road. Cause like, I'm not in a good place right now. I'm not going to be a good partner. I'm not going to, I can't give you anything because I don't have anything right now. Even though my life on the outside was going really well, my inside was completely shattered. And I had never felt so empty before. Was it like that for you? when those things shifted, were you, it was just like, what, how, like, just how do I, it's almost like nourishment, like food, like all of a sudden there's just nothing there on the inside and you're grappling in the dark and you can't feel your way through and you have like nothing really to lean on. Um, what was that like for you? Was it similar?
The moment you started sharing that story and used the word empty, I was like, oh, that's the perfect word. That's exactly how it felt. I was just empty. I had built up this fullness the last few years leading up to that. And all of a sudden it was completely gone. I didn't know how to operate. And it was just, I felt so alone for the first time after, I'd felt alone to a level, a large part of my life. And then I found spirit, and that just like little puzzle piece filled in and everything was good. And then all of a sudden it was ripped away again. Yeah, it was miserable. But I think, looking at that sort of experience for you and I think you'll firmly believe this too, is like whenever you feel the most alone, you are the most with God. You're the most loved. It's like I think of a parent that lets their child go through a difficult situation because they need to, not because they aren't capable of, the child isn't capable or the parent isn't capable of supporting the child through it, but there's a level where that is not supportive. It's not helpful to the child. The child needs to experience this and feel and go through it and learn and become, and they come out the other side stronger, more loving. And that's what I think that experience was for you and I, and like what I think that experience is for everyone. And I think that's actually how I end up, because I end up in this analogy a lot without thinking about it. But I think that's how I end up viewing God the most, in the way that makes most sense to me in my human mind, as like the perfect parent. What would that parent do? How is that parent supporting us going from child into adulthood, from a human into our most God-like self? And it's growth through love, go through pain, go through darkness, go through having our hand held, growth through, all the different things.
Absolutely. Because that's what love is, right? True love is saying no. True love is being like, you can handle this and I'm
Mm-hmm.
here. I'm standing right here, but you need to go through this. For me, that's the same. It's, when I go to kind of give my little explainer, when I do my
Mm-hmm.
workshops and stuff about God on the front end, because of course I don't want to make anyone feel excluded when I utilize that word, since I know it can be so triggering. But I always share, the way that I grew up, the experience that I've always had with God, I use the pronoun he. And I use the pronoun he because to me, God always was a father. And I think that in my personal life, like there's no one on this planet that I am more alike and more loved than my father. And God is just like, 10 times above that, way the best parent. And that is always how I've seen that relationship in regards to where I'm being supported or where I'm being allowed to walk that, that line by myself. And I think that, like I was just saying, like that is what love is. Like, why would I want a God who always steps in and like fixes everything for me? How would I ever learn anything that
End
way?
up a
How would I
spoiled
ever
brat.
mature? Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And you can use that analogy in so many different ways. People always want to be able to explain God and understand why God does this or God allows this to happen or that to happen. But you have to think of it from like a child perspective. Do you understand everything that your parents do? Heck no, you don't. Not until you become a parent yourself. And then if you're a mature parent, maybe you can understand some of those things more. But while we're still children, we don't understand. And I think that that's a beautiful thing. I also think that as far as I'm concerned, the way that we go through these different stages in our relationship with God is just like we go in different stages of relationships with friends, with partners. You know, there's always like an inevitable area where things kind of level out, right? Like they just kind of maybe get stagnant, and or you go through a really difficult time with someone and you either make it through that time or you don't. But when you make it through that time, you go up to that next level with them. You become that much more intimate with them. You understand them better. You understand yourself better. And that is what I believe these sort of ins and outs, you know, the ebb and flow that happen with God is so that we really come to not just know God in the midst of it, but also get to know ourselves in the midst of that. And that relationship just like continues, you know, like I don't think it'll ever stop evolving until we rejoin, you know, God one day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it just comes in different ways and different textures, to different phases for whatever it is we're needing at that point of our life, and however it is we're supposed to experience God at that moment. Be that sometimes completely nothing, right? Like there's times where it's not of service for you to have a parent around. You need to just be on your own, navigating, figuring it out. At some point, that parent will come back around. But what do you say to the person who's always wanted to have that experience with God and hasn't or doesn't? Because I think that can be such a heartbreak too.
I think if someone was to, you know, like I've definitely had a lot of atheists have,
Mm-hmm.
you know, like want to debate God, want to talk about God. And I think it, you know, like there's so many different variables there, so many different questions that I would have for someone before I would ever like recommend anything or say
Yeah.
this or that. You know what I mean? Um, but I just think it kind of goes back to like your heart. Are you in touch with your heart? You know, do you feel your heart? Are you leading life with your mind or are you leading life with your heart? You know, I think that one of the big things that I often see with folks who have really like difficult problems connecting with their spirituality or just, you know, connecting with God is when we live from that mental space and we're not living from our heart space. You know, we're not living from that place of feeling, of knowing, of, you know, like being able to be a child and walk outside and be like, oh my gosh, it's so beautiful today. It's incredible. You know what I mean? Versus being able to like, you know, be this from this logical place and walk outside and be like, oh, well, yes, it's nice outside because of this and this and that. You know what I mean? Like those are two
Mm-hmm.
completely different experiences. And some of us, I think, get stuck in the logical because that feels safer. That feels like there we can talk about it. We can make it something physical. We can explain versus what happens in the metaphysical, the things we can't touch or feel necessarily, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think it really is kind of going back to root, you know, that beginning space, like where are we living life from, and doing some excavation there, getting some understanding there, because God's everywhere. You know this. You know, God's in the trees and the ground and the freaking wall. And like you were saying before, in the Bhagavad Gita, you know, it talks about like there are endless paths to God. There is no one way. And we all come at it in whatever way we come at it. Some people, it comes through art, other people through sports, other people through
Mm-hmm.
religion. You know what I mean? And it's all valid. It doesn't have to look the same for everybody. But I do think that in wanting to connect with our spiritual selves, which I believe is coming back to that God within and or connecting with God, which is really the same thing, is being able to live life from that heart space versus the mental.
Yeah. I'm with you on that so much that like I think there's no other point that's more important, especially with where we've gone in this conversation. But for anyone, like we come into this place wanting, you're talking about that person, the seeker that wants to seek God and understand God. And, there's such a mental energy there. And that brain is the only thing that separates us from truth, which is heart, which is experience. And when you're speaking, I was just thinking about how much coming to know God is just a felt experience. And the only thing that will ever block that off is disconnection from your heart. So for that seeker, it's like, yeah, you're trying to seek it and understand it from this mental place, and you keep getting denied. You're wanting this thing to happen, and it's just not happening. And you go everywhere for it, and it's just not coming. But what you've sought after has always been there, just sitting, waiting. And it hasn't been this external thing. It's been just sitting inside you in your heart, waiting to be felt. And I think that slow pause, what we did at the very beginning of this, taking a second just to breathe and drop in, that's the greatest thing you can do. You become more connected to yourself, and in turn, more connected to that God within you. That's the magic.
It is the magic. I completely agree. So I'd love to ask you, I wanted to ask you earlier, but I didn't want to break you off in the midst of your story. But I'm really curious to hear where do you see God in the Akashic Records? Like, what is that connection for you? Or is there one? Or, you know what I mean? Like, I'm just curious to know from your perspective how those two things are combined, experienced. Or not.
This is one of those things that's ever evolving for me. What I'll say is I see God as everything, right? All things. So the records are a part of that. And so, if we're kind of talk about it linearly, the records are probably a step or two below God. But I view the records as a tool. So it's a tool that I can use to connect to God, to connect to source. It's like see myself as like this person wanting to look out at the stars. So I go take this telescope. That telescope is the records. It kind of gives me some direction, and I can look at the stuff that's beyond me and receive this information and see the stars. But the stars, everything that's beyond me, that's God. Yeah.
How do you experience God in the records, or do you experience God in the records? Like when you're channeling or communicating?
I have, and not recently though. In years past, it was what I described of like this very big presence with all this energy, and it's very forceful, and it's and it's not really what God is. The times I've experienced God outside the records have been what feels more true and more pure to what I would expect, and at a soul level, what I know God to be. It's this soft, loving truth and presence. Yeah, when I had experienced God, I mean, I've channeled this God energy many, many, many times, and it's this big old powerful thing. But it was just what I view that it was just an aspect of this greater energy. But that's the aspect of it that wanted to come through and be channeled and be shared. But it wasn't the true thing. It was just a part of it. Whereas when I've experienced God outside the records in these little moments, it's true. It's that full thing that just makes you stop and take a deep breath and probably cry for just a split second out of just pure love and joy.
Yeah, I'm
But
getting like teary just thinking about it.
uh, but we'll see. I mean, my connection to God, my connection to the records has changed over and over. So maybe tomorrow I'll go into the records and experience God in that way or in a very different way. And I'll come back on the podcast and have more to share.
Well, I think that's the beauty of the records is that they continuously evolve. Just again, similar to our relationship with God. You
Mhm.
know, there's always a step up, there's always a transformation at some point in time. Something new comes in, communication happens in a new way, whatever the case may be. Um, God for me has always been so gentle and soft. And I honestly think like that's, you know, just not only I think if God had come in as loud and booming, then that would have like really pushed
Scared you.
my no, I think I would have been
Yeah.
like, honestly, I would
That's some
have,
bullshit.
yeah, I would have
Yeah.
thought that that was like very like egoic or
Hmm.
too human. You know, it's
Yeah.
the gentleness that hushes me, not the intensity, right? It's the like I love you no matter what that like blows my mind and impresses me, not the like, you know,
Hmm.
like big chest out, like, um, and that was always a thing for me when I would get in these discussions with people and they would be asking me these questions and, you know, I couldn't answer them, of course. And I was like, why? Why would you ever want to believe in any God that you could just explain away? Because if you can, then they're human. And I
Hmm.
don't know about you, but I'm
That's
not
not God.
worshiping a human.
Yeah.
Hell no.
That was my
um,
gripe with Buddhism. I'm worshiping this human who learned to ascend. I was like, that's just not, no, that's not right.
uh,
But
yeah.
I think, I mean, to your point, like we're kind of just grasping at straws to understand what God is. And that's the truth of it. That's the way it's supposed to be. And that's the magic of it too. Like it's something so great that we can't fully perceive or comprehend,
I think it's the opposite. I think it's so
but we can fully.
simple.
Yeah.
I think it's so simple that we miss it. And that is God is love. Like literally, since I was a kid, it's just been like, why do we have to have all of these rules and regulations and things and blah? Like, I just always knew the only thing God wants from us is to love and to try not to judge. And if we can actually do those two things, which are really freaking hard, everything falls in line. You know, like
Mhm.
we wouldn't need laws, we wouldn't need restrictions, we wouldn't need all of these different things if we literally lived from this place of love and we didn't judge one another, which of course is love, you know, but like if that is really how we represented ourselves out there, then we wouldn't need all of the other things. It would be that simple. And I think it really is that simple. But we're humans. We make a cluster F of it.
So the magic is coming back in and just letting your heart feel some love because that's how you get there, which
Yeah,
is also really
absolutely.
freaking hard too. So,
Well, I think that there's, you know, I think that you touched on some ways. Breath work, I think, is a beautiful way to touch in on that God within. I think meditation can also offer that as well. I think that there's a number of different, you know, I think it also comes back to like, what do we love? Like for those of us who love dancing, man, I don't know about you, Neil, but I have definitely been on the salsa floor and I'm like doing my thing and lost in the music. And I'm just like,
that's love in its purest right there.
this you know like you're in flow, you're with God, you're it doesn't have to be a holy practice, but I think that those are the moments that we can touch into God. And that's why I think people who kind of get lost in the intellectualism overlook it, right? It's the feeling, it's the that connection.
Yeah. God is felt, it's experienced through exactly, the way what I was saying earlier. Like we experience God in the way we need to through certain religions or certain things, but like also through certain loves and joys. That's God.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important to say that it's not just this like deep ritualistic thing. It's in these little joys that we have, these massive joys that we have, getting lost on the dance floor, which I was also just looking at salsa classes earlier. So joining you in that soon. We'll get lost in love together.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's I am continuously reminded of, and I know I probably sound like a broken record on this podcast or in my writings or whatever the case may be, but my guides keep reminding me of the fact that it's supposed to be fun. We take it way too seriously, just all of it, you know? And yes, we can find God in these very sacred moments, but we can also just learn how to have fun and find God that way too. Um, so kind of in closing here, as we're winding down a bit, I'd love for you to just kind of share with us a little bit about how you're currently communicating with God, like what is most aligned for you at this point in time, and also any advice that you would have for anyone who's listening and really resonating with you. And yeah.
We go through our phases, and this is the one thing I'm figuring out right now. What does my spirituality look like? What does my connection to God look like? And I'm coming out of those months where I learned to find that faith in this God beyond me. Currently, and this is the part that's really hard for me because it's the opposite of what I've learned these last few years. It's finding and acknowledging God as me. This is, and I say that in the most non-egoic way possible, but part of what I'm navigating is just listening to what I know I need to do, what I know is best for myself, rather than this little intuitive voice that I've come into search for and listen to over the last few years. And knowing that that's right. My own thought process, my own free will is the God in me. And that's right now really freaking hard to do, because I've gone so far in the other direction and taken myself so far, separating from my mind and going so deeply into my heart and going so deeply into my body and connecting so deeply to source beyond me and all these things. And right now it's kind of, you know me, this is my 6 year. And so much of it is about balance. And this is a large part of that. It's fully acknowledging myself and all the different parts of me, which means Neil and my mind and my knowing and all these things are also God and of God. But I think for anyone figuring it out, to appease the mind here, know that it's different. You go through different phases. So the way that you've sought out or experienced spirit or source in the past was true and valid, but that may not be it right now. And I think if we pause and pay attention and listen to where it is we're being pulled, where our focus is naturally wanting to go, we can begin to figure out what that looks like now in this current phase. So as much as I'm talking about honoring, this part of me that I've denied over the last few years, for someone else, it can be finding God through spirit, through energy work, through healing, through tarot, through Tony Robbins. It can be anything. But know that it may not look the way you expect it to or want it to.
I love that. All right, Neil. Where can people find you? How can they work with you? All the things.
I am easily accessible, easily findable. And that's a new word that I'm going to use, findable. And everything is under my name. So Instagram, my website, neildisy.com, NEILDISY. And I also have a podcast called Heart Soul Human. I do one-on-one readings with people. I do emotional healing, do spiritual mentorship. If you are interested, I am here for you. Let's hang out. That's all I can say.
I love it.
Come have some heart together.
Yes. And I'm going to be on Neil's podcast at some point in time in the future. We're going to give it another
coming
shot.
few weeks. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Neil, for sharing your time and your story and just, showing up open-hearted and giving so much. I appreciate it. I love what you bring to planet Earth and am very grateful for your friendship. So it's nice to be able to navigate life with someone else who's doing so authentically. And I have a lot of respect. Someone had to say hello at some point in time. Yeah. He did good. Look at, he's like, oh.
Yeah. That's all she wrote.
All right, folks. Well, thank you so much for joining Neil and I today. You know what to do. If you were inspired by today's interview, please make sure to leave a great review on iTunes, Spotify, subscribe. Definitely sign up for the email list so you can get all the podcast updates, helpful resources, and so much more that I don't share anywhere else. Sending you big love for the week ahead. And don't forget, when we invest in ourselves, the world benefits. Until next week.